I have an apology to make. So some months ago I met up with Lindy Beige at the filming of a Time Commanders episode that was done for the web. And before anybody asks, where's the episode? We haven't seen it. I reiterate what I did say at the time, with that episode was filmed for publicity, web content, and it has to be said, it wasn't very useful because they didn't provide us with the web content. So you're not going to see that episode on TV. By all means, contact the BBC and complain about that and say where we want Lindy Beige and Matt Easton on TV, and maybe they'll do something about it. But the apology comes because in talking with Lloyd at the time, I pointed out that we say in Britain Left-tenant, and Americans say Loo-tenant. Now, because of the spread of American culture through games and movies and TV shows and everything else, lots of British people now say Loo-tenant. And for lots of British people, that can grate slightly because we were taught that you should say Left-tenant. And therefore we go, don't use the American way of saying it. You should be saying Left-tenant, not Loo-tenant. Now, here's my apology. Having read a bit about this topic, I did Army Cadets at school from age, I think, about 14 to 18. Some of my friends went into the army, some of my friends are still in the army. And so I researched the Victorian Army, and very much in those contexts, it should be Left-tenant, because that's what we say in Britain. That's convention. However, I'm going to say something which you won't hear me say very often. The British are wrong. Now, I understand that Lloyd will probably take great grievance with me saying this, and I'm sorry, Lloyd, but I think, having reviewed the available evidence, I think that Lieutenant is actually more correct than Left-tenant. Firstly, it is a French word, okay, and in France it's lieutenant or something like that. This is my bad French pronunciation, but it should be lieutenant. And the Americans, for example, actually borrowed a lot of their military structures, even their uniforms, even their swords. Styles of swords they borrowed from the French army, because in the middle of the 19th century the French army was seen as the kind of the model, what other people should emulate. The French, and to a degree the Prussians as well. Interestingly, not the British Army, despite the fact that Britain's empire was the biggest at that point. The Americans, and probably historically as well, because, you know, we all know that the French are to thank essentially for American independence, because the American War of Independence probably never would have resulted in independence without French assistance. Particularly look up the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, and French, particularly naval involvement, was very critical in assisting the rebels to break away from the glorious empire on which the sun never sets. But lieutenant, of course, in America they say lieutenant because a lot of their military structures were copied on the French, and so the French say lieutenant, so the Americans say lieutenant. In Britain, it's lost in the mists of time, as far as I can tell, based on what I can find online and books I've read and so on and so forth. And we don't really know exactly why in Britain we say Left-tenant. Now, I understand that Lloyd's explanation would probably be because lieutenant means left in charge, essentially, or left tenant in position. And so in French, that makes perfect sense. It means a lieutenant is someone who's left in charge of coordinating something, or in charge of defending something or a position. But in English, perhaps it could be that this translated into, Left-tenant, because we have the word tenant, obviously from Norman French in Britain, and so therefore if you're Left-tenant, you're left in charge of the thing. So it makes a certain degree of sense to people in Britain who didn't necessarily know French that you would be Left-tenant of something, left managing something. But the problem is that we still spell it lieutenant. We don't spell it Left-tenant. Now, if we spelt it Left-tenant, there's no issue, but we spell it lieutenant. So if it's spelt lieutenant, it should be said lieutenant. Now, interestingly, I find that the Wikipedia article on this topic, and I don't often quote Wikipedia, so please forgive me for this, does in fact mention this, and apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently in the 19th century there was some debate in Britain about whether we should use the word lieutenant and whether we should instead replace it with an English word that made more sense to English soldiers and sailors. But obviously that didn't happen, and we still use lieutenant. But and one other thing as well, is that there's some theory that perhaps that lieutenant comes from Old Norman French. And Norman French, one thing you have to say about the French language, I'm not an expert on the French language, I'm not a linguistic expert like Metatron is, but I have spent quite a bit of time in France, and one thing I've learned is that there used to be lots of different forms of French all over France, and in the 18th, 19th century it was unified into what we now know as French. But before the 18th century, or before even the 19th century, there wasn't one French language. There were lots of French dialects. And in Normandy, for example, and remember of course that a lot of French words came into England from the Normans after William the Conqueror, and then all of the Norman lords that essentially ruled over England after that, and then later on also with the Angevins and so on and so forth, and the Plantagenets. So we took words from certain areas of France that in some cases are trapped in a time bubble and are different from modern French. And one example of those could be lieutenant, and it could be that it was said in England in the Middle Ages, because the word was used to some degree in the medieval period, I understand, just like the word sergeant comes from France, and the word lieutenant may have originally been spelled differently. It may have been Left-tenant, because this follows more Norman French conventions. So it's possible there is a historical linguistic explanation for the fact that in Britain we say lieutenant rather than lieutenant as well. But to conclude, I would say that by and large the British are wrong, because it's a French word, and if you're spelling it lieutenant, I think it's absolutely fine. If we spelt it the Norman way with an F in it, if it was spelt lif or tenant, then we would say lieutenant, and that would make sense. But instead we have a word that is clearly spelt in the modern French way, lieutenant, and we say it lieutenant, and that is wrong. However, it's not going to change, so this video is not going to change anything, but I want it to be known that I'm not a raging British nationalist or English nationalist or whatever we're going to be. Who knows, even if there'll be a Britain in a year's time. Topical. But I want it to be known that I believe in truth, and that, you know, if we spell it lieutenant, we should say it lieutenant. So for once, maybe this has happened other times, but certainly for this occasion, American English I think is more accurate and more correct than British English. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.